welcome everybody to another edition of Let's Talk About It. This is Susan Johnson, and my co-host Dennis O'Brien is off because he is running for office. And so, with that said, we're still continuing with Let's Talk About It, and we have a wonderful guest this evening. This is Brian Anderson, and he is the Legislative Director for Council for AFSCME, and they've been doing a huge amount of work trying to make sure that the prison guards are safe, and also making sure that people who are incarcerated are being treated fairly and have the balance that we're trying to create in our system, so that we have a situation where our prison guards are safe and our prisoners are going to be in a situation where they're going to be rehabilitated so that they can move on with their lives once they've met their requirements that have been ordered by the court. So these are the things that we'll be discussing today, and I'm very, very honored to have Brian Anderson here with us on the show. Welcome to the show, Brian.
Hey, thank you, Susan. It's an honor to be on, and like I said, it's an honor to represent correction officers and the other corrections employees. They're good folks.
Yes, they are, and in fact, we have wonderful people, even who have been corrections officers and now serve in the legislature. Our good friend and Senate Chair of Appropriations is a former corrections officer, and she understands a lot of these issues. Senator Austin understands a lot of the issues, and she agrees that behavioral health is a real issue with incarcerated people. And so with those kinds of things, I know that there have been a number of things that I would like you to start from the beginning, and let's talk about what legislation we passed last time that was vetoed by the governor, and then some negotiations occurred that gave prisoners less time in the cell, gave them more time outside of the cell, gave less time for solitary confinement, and all of those things which many people feel that maybe there's not enough adequate staffing perhaps to actually protect the guards who are there now with more additional time in the prisons for people to be out of their cells. So tell us a little bit about that.
Right. What's going on right now, Susan, it's of particular concern to our union, our whole union, but particularly our correction members, is that there has been a measurable escalation in inmate on-staff assaults. That's been in the news media a lot lately. What's been in less is the incidence of inmate-on-inmate assaults has gone up in a similar fashion. And there was legislation that was passed, much of which our folks were okay with, but some of which really has posed a challenge and made conditions less safe, and that is a fairly big increase now of cell time. And the problem with that is that the facilities are not really set up for having lots of inmates mill around in them. They were designed and architecturally constructed in a way to keep people more under control rather than milling around a lot. So that's created a real challenge for our staff. To give you, for instance, our members have told me that they have to provide recreation time under the law for the inmates, an increase of it. But because the facilities are not laid out for it, our officers will try to provide recreation for, say, 5 different groups of inmates, some of whom are very much at odds with the other group, in the same hallway at the same time, simply because of lack of space. So that is a real challenge.
Well, that sounds to me, let me just interrupt you there for a second, just to kind of fully understand what it was before these changes in the law occurred and what it is now, now that the changes in the law have occurred, and why would they bring out groups of prisoners that are at odds with one another? And how do they develop a decision about being at odds with one group or the other? I guess is a question as well.
Well, it's interesting because there are gangs, so that's one big problem area. But there are also what's become known as neighborhood clusters, where it's folks who aren't in a gang, but they could be in the same city but very much at odds with each other. And I don't pretend to be an expert on that, but it's almost got an element that is a civilian feels sort of like a gang situation. And our staff are supposed to stay on top and try to monitor who's at odds with who. The other thing that's a challenge, Susan, is sometimes within, for instance, a gang, you'll have a power struggle. And our folks are supposed to sort of figure out who's at odds with who to keep everybody safe. At the same time, corrections officers are not supposed to build a fraternal relationship with inmates because that's a big no-no. They can be fired for that. So they're supposed to know everything that's going on, but at the same time, they're not supposed to get so close that management feels like they violated the law on fraternization, which they can get fired for. And some of the examples of the firings are just head scratchers.
Sure, and that's very, very difficult. When you look at the circumstances, it seems to me that the prison guards in some ways need to be almost therapists. They need to have the understanding of how to do mental health first aid, which is tamping people down when they get too annoyed and aggravated and anxious, and understanding these kinds of things that I kind of have stolen from my work in the mental health area.
Good point. And I think that's been part of the transition from the old days when they were prison guards to today's corrections officers, who are a lot more professional. Correction officers do receive some counseling training. There are corrections counselors. Officers receive some training in how to try to diffuse things. I think the best psychologists I've ever worked with in our big union, which represents more than corrections staff, are retired corrections officers who come to work for the union. I've never met people better at talking folks out of doing something destructive or something reckless. And I think that's part of what keeps the lid on correctional institutions where these facilities run understaffed classically. The state tries very hard to cut down on any overtime costs, and that leads to what are called posts being unfilled. And there are a couple of different types of posts. There are mandatory posts where correction staff must be at those posts for a bare minimum level of safety. Then there are other posts that are often pulled and seen as less crucial posts. But at a time we're in now with a high level of assaults, our union is asking that all the posts be filled. Sometimes this gets confused with hiring more officers. There's a sufficient number of officers on board to fill the posts. But what the state is doing at times is being so conscious of not having the overtime budget go up that they compromise the safety of the institutions by having the posts unfilled. So the time where we are right now, where we've seen this escalation in assaults by that small percentage of assaulted inmates, it would help to have all the posts filled. And of course, there's an increased cost to that. But the cost of that compared to the cost of injury of inmates and staff, I think is small in comparison.
Now, have you, that brings to mind a couple of questions. One is that seems to be known to the prison guards and the administrators, who the people are that cause the most problems, and they may have it may be more mental illness, or it may be other things that are not mental illness, but are some things that are creating, or maybe someone who is more of a control person with the other inmates because they have a better capacity to manipulate them and work with them and that sort of thing. So they create, like you said, gangs and that sort of thing. Is there a way where they can be moved into an area where the people who are the most aggressive and most controlling, creating these issues to a area or a section of the prison or somewhere else that would make them, maybe help adjust them to being able to get ready to leave the prison once they're finished doing their time?
I'm an optimist, and I think there's got to be a way to do it. The legislation that passed created a challenge in that if an inmate was assaulted, you had a series of sort of sanctions that you could place on an inmate and rewards you could give to inmates for better behavior. We had administrative segregation, where an inmate who was assaulted could be separated from everybody else and put on a step-down program where, as their behavior got better, they are given more liberty. And that was a pretty effective system. With the new rules that have passed, someone is not allowed to sort of be segregated out for more than 15 days in a 30-day period, or 30 days in a 60-day period. And that's created a challenge because some of the assaultive inmates have told our corrections officers, in fact, immediately after the assault, I'll see you in 15 days. I can stand on my head for 15 days. I'll come back in 15 days and assault you again.
So let me stop you right there, because we go back to, and this is just a general analysis of what, being a place in a segregated or a separated area, like a solitary confinement area, and how that actually wears on people's behavioral health as well, and that it creates more behavioral health issues than trying to keep people in more of an interactive area. So I was thinking more in terms of people that have those kinds of issues. Would they be in a situation where they would be, say, in a separate, not in solitary, but say a separate institution? If there's a group that is more difficult to manage, so you'd put them in a separate institution with more psychologists, psychiatrists, more better prison to guard ratio, that kind of thing.
Well, one of the things, Susan, is I think this whole discussion of solitary confinement has not reflected reality. I think the advocates overstate it. Connecticut hasn't had anything resembling solitary confinement for decades. Administrative segregation was never solitary confinement. In administrative segregation, inmates would get 2 hours of recreation a day. They would constantly be seen throughout the day by mental health staff, by the staff that comes in to feed them, staff that comes in to check on them. So this vision of solitary confinement where someone is locked away to be in a dark room. For instance, the ACLU had a mock cell up at the state capitol. That mock cell reflected nothing that exists in Connecticut or has existed for, you probably have to go back 60 or 70 years. So I think that case is overstated. I think if listening to staff, what they've told me is, if we could find a way to have those 50 or 60 highly assaultive inmates treated in a more safe way. We did have a place where we would have inmates like that go, and that was Northern. Northern has been shut down. I don't believe Northern will be reopened from what lawmakers tell me, so I've told our members, don't even ask to have Northern reopened. It's not going to happen.
How big a place is Northern? Does it just hold 50 or 60?
I don't think Northern probably ever held more than 60 inmates for most of its time. I think there's space for a lot more. I think a lot of things were designed, Susan, around the late 80s and early 90s when we had some really awful riots in the corrections facilities, including one where 2 inmates were murdered by other inmates during a riot. So Northern had more capacity, but I don't think it was ever used. So now Northern sits empty. Now, advocates have decried Northern as if it's Devil's Island. I've toured Northern. I didn't think it was like that. When I was there was a lot of staff there taking care of a relatively small number of these highly assaultive inmates. And I thought it made sense. But I understand. I know politics. I can count votes. Northern is not going to get reopened. But there are other things we can do with the existing number of facilities to make things safer. And like I said, there are probably about, I haven't looked at the latest count, but there are between 9,000 and 10,000 folks incarcerated. 90% of them keep their head down. They just want to serve their time. They want to get out. The 50 or 60 highly assaultive inmates are the really dangerous ones. As you know, we had an officer stabbed in the neck.
Yes.
About 2 weeks ago.
Yes.
That was really severe. That officer could have easily been killed.
This is one of the reasons I called you, is because I see that
You've
this is
been great.
connected to...
I appreciate your concern. You called us right away on that.
Yes, and I wanted to make sure that we got the information out from you, because I know how objective you are, and I know that this has been the changes that have occurred, or they were made in conjunction with the union and the governor. And, of course, the legislature passing the laws with these changes. My sense is I didn't see where they were increasing the numbers of staff, though, which I thought would be a mistake. If they're going to have more time out, I think you need more staff. If they're going to keep the 50 or 60 integrated with the rest of the group, how is that fair to the rest of the group? And the other thing is, I mean, it's pretty well documented that people with hair trigger tempers have some kind of other brain dysfunction that creates that situation, whether it's post-traumatic stress disorder, which many of the prisoners probably have anyway, but it's a matter of degree, or they have a neurological difficulty. And I'm wondering, to what extent has the prison system looked into the neurological difficulties for people that have hair trigger tempers?
It's a good question, Susan, and I'm not able to give you a great answer on that. What I can tell you is corrections staff, as part of a list of things that we asked the governor for not so many days ago, our folks asked for a filling of the posts, some way to handle these highly assaultive inmates, but also more mental health services for inmates, more classes for inmates to take so that out-of-cell time is used constructively, more vocational training for inmates. The nice thing about our corrections officers, as opposed to the old days when they were prison guards, Today's corrections officers try to see the whole picture and care about correcting the inmates' behaviors so they don't come back. When they come back, our staff feels like they failed. They want them to be successful on the outside, so they advocated for more job training for inmates, more education for inmates, more mental health services. You and I have talked in the past about the loss of Norwich Hospital and Fairfield Hills Hospital. And once when I was touring New Haven Correctional, I talked to a mental health clinician who told me he was seeing the same folks that he saw when he worked at Fairfield Hills. And I said, oh, they're very similar. And he said, no, they're not very similar. They are literally the same people. So when we shut Fairfield Hills Norwich Hospital, it would seem that we very much transferred those folks into the prison system. Now, that was some time ago that happened, but I wouldn't be surprised if things have gotten no better since that time.
Well, this is something that we're going to take a break now. Brian Anderson, we're thrilled that you're here. We're getting about halfway through the show. Brian Anderson, he's the legislative director for AFSCME Council 4, and we're discussing today the changes in the law that have occurred in our prison system and the impact it's having on our prison guards. And also, we will get into some of the consequences of what happens when somebody assaults a prison guard or assaults another prisoner. What happens to that person? Don't they get more time? We'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back, everyone. This is Susan Johnson, and I'm here with my very special guest, Legislative Director for AFSCME Council 4, Brian Anderson. And we're just talking about some of the recent changes the legislature and the governor made with respect to how prisoners are treated in our prison system. And of course, the objective from all of us, we want to make sure when people are discharged from the prison system that they don't go back. We want to make sure that they get enough support from the state to learn a trade, maybe, to understand what went wrong and why they're there, and make sure that they're able to get through their time, get out, and lead a normal life. So that's the objective is, and that's what we're working on. And so thank you, Brian, for being here with us today. And so let's just talk a little bit more.
It's a pleasure, Susan.
Yeah.
And one of the things I'd like to thank you for was your work on the PTSD bill to help corrections staff. As you know, corrections officers statistically die at age 59, which is way too young. And that's almost 20 years younger than the average citizen. And it's because the high stress and mental challenges that present themselves for correction staff. Correction staff die of heart and hyper. Suicide sadly factors in. And our folks were denied PTSD workers' comp until 2019 when you and Kathy Austin, May Flexer voted for the bill. Several other legislators really helped us out. And that bill has opened up more ability for correction staff, police officers, and other first responders to get treated. And you were able to pass a bill this year that said any citizen who has experienced great trauma on the job can apply for workers' compensation for PTSD, provided they pass the test in the statute. I would respectfully ask, and I know you've been very helpful with this, that the very rigid test in the statute be made less rigid. Now, I can give you a great example with a police officer. One of our Derby police officers stopped a deranged gunman who was shooting at motorists. He shot the man, which is very sad. It was completely justified shooting that the state's attorney cleared. But after our officer shot the man, he ran up and gave him life-saving first aid. and literally, as I understand it, had to stick his fingers in the leg wound of this man to stop him from bleeding out. After that, our officer experienced mental health trauma and applied and was told, under the current statute, that doesn't qualify because it doesn't involve a death, dismemberment, or serious mutilation. And that's just, that's
well, let me just say,
a situation where an officer has to shoot someone and then literally give hands-on life-saving.
I'm saying that
PTS coverage.
Workers' compensation is only there to make money for the insurance industry. And I've been fighting workers' compensation for the last several years. And if you don't think that fixing somebody who's got a shot and is having a leg that needs a finger put in it to stop it from bleeding is not serious mutilation, I don't know what is. And I'd love to see the person who denied that claim, because it is something that is completely outrageous. And I would say that we have a horrible, 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 horrible workers' compensation system in the state because of a 2005 case that said that there is no way that you can challenge the workers' compensation industry when they do something that is outside the scope of what a normal insurance company would do with a particular injury. So they don't have any way to do an Unfair Insurances Claim Act in the state because of a Supreme Court case. And that happened back in 2005. I've been trying to address it for years. And the insurance industry is the most powerful industry in our country, and they have blocked it. But I'm thrilled that we were able to get the PTSD statute in there. And now having a situation where this claim is denied, that I don't know where in the process it is, but this officer should have been granted. That is when you're in a gunfight, the person's injured, and you're stopping him from bleeding. that to me is worthy of somebody getting enough time to address the post-traumatic stress disorder that arose from that particular circumstance. So I think that some of that has to do with a bad situation we have in Connecticut because of that Supreme Court case, and until we get that fixed, these kinds of things will occur.
And Susan, you've been really outspoken in the legislature about this kind of a thing, so we really appreciate that. You, Representative Christine Conley down out of Groton,
yep.
Kathy Austin, you've been extremely helpful.
I've been working on it. Working on it for I think about 7 years now, and I didn't do a lot with it during COVID because I knew that the Labor Committee had to really work on making sure people were treated properly if they're in a work environment and getting COVID. And of course, initially the Bar Association came out thinking that people who got COVID in a work environment, particularly in the initial stages where the protective coverings weren't available, would have gotten the coverage under the Workers' Compensation Act. Lo and behold, they did not. And they were, again, the insurance industry took away any options for people in these circumstances. So this workers' compensation program in the state leaves a lot to be desired, and it's really not a very good situation.
Right. Yeah, it needs work, and you're right. The insurance lobby is so powerful.
I had a worker. I actually got myself a work study group, and then COVID hit because I came back with the recommendations to continue it, and lots of people wanted to continue it. So I had a workers' comp task force. I had lawyers from both sides. I had all the commissioners, designees on these issues come and give testimony. I got together about 6, I think, or so meetings. I have the tapes of everything that occurred, and the insurance industry is sitting on top of all this stuff, and the stuff people have to go through to get the workers' compensation claims through the system. It's just a spider's web of appeals that the insurance industry has, and it kind of leaves out the person who's injured.
Yeah, it's amazing. And, the flip side of the coin is that the outrageous salaries that these insurance companies executives pay themselves. I believe I believe it was the top executive at Aetna paid himself something along $97 million a year.
At
They
least.
they get salary,
Yep.
which is considerably smaller, but in tens of millions, and then they give themselves stock options
Yep.
that add up to more tens of millions. So for an officer like the one I described, to be turned down, basically for financial reasons, by someone who's paying themselves in the tens of millions, it's just so highly unfair. It makes people want to scream.
Yes, it does. Or
And,
file another piece of legislation to stop them. But the only way that we're going to be able to do this is if we get groups of people together. And there's so few people that understand the impact of a bad workers' compensation system that it continues on. And when you try to explain it, it's just like all the other healthcare industry issues that I'm faced with trying to fix spider web of all types of regulations and interactions, and they are taking us. They're having our lunch over and over again. But we want to get back to your work on what we're going to do to try and make sure people leave the prison system and become citizens that work and get a job and have a good life.
right. And like our officers have advocated, we need the posts. We need to get control of the highly assaultive inmates. But our folks have also spoken up for more education for the inmates, more vocational training, so they're not just milling around in the hallways with the added cell time that the recent law changes gave inmates. When folks are just milling around, that's when trouble starts.
Well, then,
And the kind of trouble, I think the people who would be most relieved by these things would be those 90% of the inmates who are not assaultive, who were just trying to do their time and get out. We've had cases, Susan, where staff has discovered that a predatory inmate blackmailed an inmate by saying, your mother needs to put $100 a month in a check and send it to my girlfriend, and if that doesn't happen, I will beat you up. Those are the kind of things that can happen when you don't have staff really able to find out what's going on. Now, it's very dangerous for an inmate who's being extorted to report that, because obviously if it's found out, they're labeled a snitch. They can really get hurt. So it's a very challenging environment, and part of making it less challenging would be having those posts built, having more corrections officers on the scene, especially at a time like right now when these assaults are way up. God willing, that won't last, but part of the answer is to get those posts filled.
well, yes, and the other part, I mean, I'm looking at some of the things that you have indicated would be good, and I'm thinking, instead of wandering the halls, why aren't they put in classrooms? Why don't you have opportunities for additional educational opportunities so they wouldn't be able to come out of the cell unless they went to a class, and that way they're occupied. I mean, one of the things that was a great thing that Wally Lamb used to do is he used to go to the women's prison and provide reading, exercises and writing exercises so that they would be able to talk about their experiences and write books about their experiences. So that was a great thing that he did for a long time. And again, I think that if we had prison guards who could maybe teach things about behavioral health. They could teach things about making sure they get their GED. Many prisoners, my understanding is, they don't have a high school diploma even. So if we make sure they get the high school diploma and then get some training and some kind of skills so that when they get out of prison they can actually work instead of go to the homeless shelter or over to the riverbank here in Willimantic. We need to make sure that they have a place to go. We need to make sure they have something to do when they get out. and we need to make sure that the ones that my understanding from my time on appropriations looking at these issues is that we need to make sure that they have all the things they need to start a life, a place to live, instead of just being dropped off on the street. And so the ones that get off for good time, they usually have a place to go in a halfway house. The ones who are more difficult and have to do the entire time and don't get out for good behavior are the ones who need the most help, probably. So, but yet they're the ones that are left off on the street. So it's these systems really need to be looked at and really given serious attention. I raise these things with the commissioner, the prisoners, and I say, what are we doing? And it's the same answer.
Right, because we know when inmates get out, if they can't get a job that pays well enough to live on, they're almost inevitably going to go back to crime.
Right.
And it's frustrating because, you go back to Aristotle, who said 2,300 years ago that poverty is the father of crime and revolution. And you certainly see it with this population. If they're just let out from prison but have no housing to go to, no job that pays a living wage, it's a recipe for disaster.
Yes, it is. And you don't have to go that far back. When you go back after World War II, one of the things that we know happened with World War II was the fact that there was a problem with the stock market crash that impacted the economy in the world. And that's what gave Hitler his chance to go and promote fascism all throughout Europe. But what had happened is he had taken over, and they hadn't had a chance to actually show the good work that had actually happened in Germany, and he was able to build a big enough coalition to start the fascism. So that's it's all about the economy. It's about making sure people have jobs. That's why I have to say the current president bringing back our manufacturing to our country is really going to be a game changer for this country, a game changer for people. So they'll have a job when they get out of high school. They'll have a job that'll pay them. We do right now with Electric Boat. We do right now with Pratt & Whitney. The kids can get these jobs, these certifications. We've got free community college now. These are the places where kids have hope now that they didn't have before. And a lot of our folks at this point in time, have big college debts. But those things, we're creating debtors, social prisons for people who finish college and try to get a job that paid off those debts. So we have created a real bad structure for the average person in this economy, and I'm looking at hoping to fix it in terms of making sure we don't create additional poverty and more crime, because it does create crime when people have no hope and no place to go to get a job.
Susan, you make me think of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's quote that the unemployed are the armies of fascism. And one of the good things that I think has happened, like you said, as a result of increased government spending that President Biden has said, is that the unemployment rate in Connecticut is an all-time low. It's probably the lowest it's been in 60 years. I was talking to the Commissioner of Labor yesterday, who said normally 4% unemployment, or 96% employment, is considered in Connecticut full employment. So literally there are no other folks capable of working. We just exceeded that in Connecticut. Now 96.5% of Connecticut folks are working. And the unemployment rate is at 3.5%, which is a record low unemployment rate.
It is. It's considered full employment. That's right.
One of the things that my union is helping with is AFSCME Council for at a big job fair in Hartford yesterday. Over 600 people attended, and basically that job fair featured government jobs, jobs as corrections officers, police officers, DCF workers, MDC, water workers, Department of Transportation, working at UConn in maintenance, all of those jobs pay a decent pay. They provide pension. They provide health care. And there are openings in those jobs. Anybody who's listening to this and looking for work should check the Department of Administrative Services website for the state of Connecticut and check the municipalities' websites, because there are jobs where you can make a living that are out there, and they're open.
Yes, there are, and that's a relatively recent thing. And the thing is that I think historically, when you take a look at how jobs were, we had our communities. They had the jobs in the community. The kids went to school. They might go to college somewhere else, or they might go to college in the community if it's there, and they'd have a job to go to in the community, or at least in that region. And because of the loss of the manufacturing under the Reagan administration, because he gave tax credits to have the manufacturing leave the country, we haven't had that kind of benefit until now, until money that's been pumped into the economy because of COVID to keep us from crashing. And so this is where we are now, but we have to make sure we continue this process, because to stop it now is not going to be a good idea. But the money has to come from the feds, and we're going to be looking at a real crisis again in the House, in the Congress, because Congress doesn't want to, certain elements in Congress on the right wing don't want to pay the bills. They don't want to help the people. And I think that's because they're really trying to gear up for chaos, for fascism, for poverty, to get that army together so that they can eliminate the democracy we have.
Well, there's lots of evidence that if a society becomes economically imbalanced, democracy suffers.
Yep.
And we're, like you said, suffering such a huge imbalance that President Reagan gave such vast tax cuts to rich folks, followed by President George W. Bush doing the same thing, followed by President Trump doing the same thing. The rich folks have effectively shifted their tax burden onto the backs of the middle and lower income folks.
Yes.
To a point where, back during the Eisenhower administration, there was a 95% tax rate, but only rich folks paid about, the ultra-rich paid about 50% of their annual income, not their fortune, but their annual income in tax. That now is down between 9% and 0%.
Well, that's because they don't have an income tax anymore, because the very ultra-rich don't have income. They have assets and they have resources, so you can't tax their income, and that's one of the things that we haven't been able to make an adjustment and an understanding in. If you look at how we did our state income tax, we limited the short-term capital gains from 15% to 4%, and shifted the cost to the people in the state income tax back in the day.
And people wonder why their property tax went up. There's a straight line between tax cuts. Income tax cuts for the rich and an increase in your property
Thank you. And that is the cost shift from the federal to the state to the local, and that's what's happened in the state. And this is something I'm going to ask you back to talk about at another time, Brian. Brian, thank you so much for being with us on Let's Talk About It. This, ladies and gentlemen, has been Brian Anderson. He is the Council for AFSCME Director for Legislative Affairs, and we're very, very pleased to have him to talk about a current event, how we can manage our prison system to make sure that our prisoners come out and become productive citizens. Thank you so much, Brian, and we want to make sure that our corrections officers don't get injured, and that they get the kind of care that they need if they do get injured. So we appreciate you're here, we appreciate your work, and we appreciate the work of the corrections officers.
Thanks so much for having me on, Susan, and thanks for the support you've given in trying to make our officers safe. Thanks for supporting their contracts to make sure that they have a decent pay, pension, and health care. Much appreciated.
Okay. Well, we'll talk again. Have a great week, everybody, and look forward to another edition of Let's Talk About It.